This is the Thrive Podcast with Shiloh Missionary Baptist Church. And now, Pastor Fred Jeff Smith.
Hello, welcome to the 16th edition of the Thrive Podcast with the Shiloh Missionary Baptist Church. I'm Fred Jeff Smith, pastor of Shiloh, and I'm very happy for you taking the time to either view or listen to this week's edition of the podcast. I'm also delighted once again to have the Minister of Christian Education here at Shiloh as my guest, who also happens to be my beautiful wife, Demetria Lavelle Jones Smith. And I thought it would be good to have Demetria back today so that we could talk about some things relevant to upcoming events here at Shiloh, but also to talk in theological terms about certain things that are taking place in our community and in our nation. So, Demetria, thank you for taking the time to come back and share with us today.
We're glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Let's talk about Shiloh first. As we are recording this, we are about a month out from summer camp for Shiloh Missionary Baptist Church. And if you're living in the Baton Rouge area and you have children in grades kindergarten through 8, we would certainly love... Pre-K through 8.
Yes.
We would certainly love to have the opportunity to work with your children this summer in our Shiloh summer camp. You are now in your 4th year as director of the summer camp. Talk to us about that experience.
Oh, well, summer camp is just a wonderful summer, I don't know what you call it, just a jolt of electricity with all the kids being here. This is my 4th year, as you said, that I have been the director of summer camp. And we have some new things on tap this year for Summer Camp 2018. First of all, we have always had about 100 kids, maybe a little less the last couple of years, a few less. But this year we're excited because there's a camp that was operating in another location, and they asked 2 years ago to come under our umbrella and to fold their kids into our program, and we weren't able to do it last year. But this year we're able to do it, and so one of our church members is working with that, and she's coming in on staff with us, Ida, and we're really excited so that we're really gonna have a good number of kids this summer, and we're excited. So we're probably gonna be double our capacity this year.
That's fabulous.
That's pretty good.
It really is.
It means it'll be busy, but we're excited.
It also, I think that it's important that people recognize that summer camp is not just a place where you drop kids off and they run around and play all day, but that you actually have a structured curriculum, a structured program that the children will be involved in.
Very much so. Our goal with summer camp is to make sure that kids are exposed to both academics and enrichment all summer long. This year we go for 10 weeks. And we want to make sure that during this time, this summer time, the time that the kids are away from the classroom, that they don't lose some of the information that they've gained. It's estimated that kids can lose as much as, I think it's 2.8 months of learned instruction over the summer. And so our goal is twofold. We want to help kids retain the information that they learned the previous academic year and get them ready to go into the new year, into their rising grade, and to do so on a wonderful footing. And so in the morning we have academics and math, reading, science, social studies, language arts, and then in the afternoon is when we have our enrichment activities. So music, dance, physical education, where we're getting the kids out of just sitting, but being involved in moving. And all of our academic instruction is by certified teachers who work either in the EBR system or other schools around our area. And so students are taught by certified teachers who are excited about teaching. You know, we don't have teachers who are tired of teaching. That by the time they get to the summer, they don't have anything left left to give. No, we want teachers that are enthusiastic, who love kids, and really want to make sure that our kids bridge the summer and that they start the new year ready. So while we're not trying to make it that the kids are in school, that's not the goal, because we know kids get tired too. Their job is to be a student, and so we don't want to bore them with academics, but we want to make sure that they're invigorated and excited about what they've learned and what they can retain over the summer. And then we do so with a little twist. So we find ways to integrate the academics into enrichment and vice versa, and then introduce them to new things. So we're really excited this year. I'm especially excited about how we're going to be able to integrate the idea of ecology and food theology into the summer program with our community garden. A lot of people don't know that Shiloh has a community garden. And over the last couple of years, it's kind of fallen into, I don't want to say disrepair, but we're revamping it. And so it's very important to me that kids understand where their food comes from, the idea of food production. And I believe that when they know that, they have a better sensitivity towards food insecurity, and also a sensitivity towards the creative agency that is inherent in God's creation. And so they get to be a part of getting their hands dirty, so to speak, and being connected to the earth. And so there's a way that you can integrate the idea of ecology and agriculture and food science into language arts, into science, definitely, into social studies, just talking about the history of African Americans with the cultivated earth. And so really excited about the things that we're going to be doing this summer. 10 weeks. Kids have field trips every week, and just doing some exciting things.
Let's go back just a bit. You merged two words into a term that I'm not sure everyone is familiar with, food theology. Mm-hmm. Theology, of course, has to do with the study of God. Mm-hmm. As my professor, Fisher Humphrey, used to say, it's just a big word that means thinking about God.
Yes.
But you merge that with the idea of food. Elaborate a little bit more on food theology.
Well, we often don't think about this, but in particularly in the church, just talking about practical lived experience, a lot of what we do surrounds fellowship. Think about when we have a funeral. Mm-hmm. And the repast and how important that is to the family and the fellowship. But it goes beyond just the idea of hospitality in churches. It has to do with the fact that when you think about it in terms of the Bible and in Genesis, the very beginning, it says that God created humankind, and God put humankind in the story of Adam and Eve, put them in the garden to work and till the earth. Mm-hmm. And so that the relationship between what you eat and tending the earth is not just an arbitrary thing, but the earth is God's creation, obviously. So the idea of food theology is connecting our understanding of God being in all things, even what we consume in our bodies. And so there's a whole area in the realm of theological enterprise or thought that deals with food, and not just as a social justice issue, mm-hmm. Food security, but what is a theology of food, and how does that relate to our everyday living, and it's centered in Scripture.
Mm-hmm. It's an interesting concept, food theology.
Yeah, food theology. Or theology of food.
Well, it gives you a different way of thinking about food, and therefore it changes the way that you think about the consumption of food as well.
Yes.
So I just found that to be an interesting thing to latch on to.
And even beyond that, there's a whole movement, and this is nothing new. I mean, I grew up, my grandfather had a whole lot next to the family home that was a garden. He was from North Louisiana, and so he learned how to farm at a very young age and brought that with him to Missouri. But more than that, churches, faith-based communities, whether they be churches or synagogues or even Muslim temples, you have this movement that people are understanding that poverty exists not because there's not enough to go around. Poverty exists because we don't will it away, meaning we don't do what we need to do in a distribution of resources in this country, in this world, to ensure that food makes it to everyone who needs it. And so there's this movement among faith-based communities to connect their congregations to the earth. And in doing so, they make sure that they have access to quality grown produce and food, because you have some faith communities that are working with ranchers and growing eggs and having their own hens and things like that. But our way that they can ensure that their congregation gets quality produce, quality food, and they know where it comes from. And so it's all the circle in many ways of the circle that was started in the Bible in Genesis with creation, that we're all connected together. So you have faith communities all over the country, black, white, just people who are worried about people having access to good quality food, and then taking the means of production or ownership back into their own hands, and so that they can create their own community gardens, their own food co-ops, that they, you might not end up having to go to the grocery store for everything, that you can create your own network of food. And then where you know where your food's coming from, but also that you have a greater amount of self-determination with regards to making sure that your congregation gets adequate food, because
You say poverty does not exist because there's a lack. I would go so far as to say poverty exists to create lack, so that in a capitalistic society, certain people can exploit the lack in order to become wealthy.
To become wealthy and keep certain groups of people from having access to what they need.
That's where the exploitation comes from.
So then they stay dependent.
How else do you explain a country that pays people to not grow food?
Yes, pays for farms and fields to stay fallow.
Yeah. And how else do you explain that in the wealthiest, most successful country in the history of the earth, that there are people who go to bed hungry every night, in the total of millions? So the whole idea of capitalistic exploitation, as it plays itself out in food, as well as in other aspects of our lives, is a very real thing that the church must continue to address. I dare not say that the church needs to find new ways to address, because you address it. It's just that so often your voice is drowned out by the other voices that seem to prevail over you. As we're sitting here, the most recent jobs numbers came out today.
Yes.
And 164,000 jobs, I believe, were added across the nation, and people were shouting hoorays because
And the percentage.
The unemployment level dropped in this nation below 4%.
Yes, 3.9%.
And someone was saying to me a minute ago, aren't those great numbers? And my response was, go to Scotland Square in North Baton Rouge and tell people that unemployment is at 3.9%, and then come down to Eddie Robinson Drive and stand at Eddie Robinson and Government Street and say that unemployment is 3.9%, and then go to South Boulevard and say that unemployment is 3.9%, and see what your response is going to be to that. Those numbers do not reveal the realities of unemployment, and therefore poverty, and denied access not just to food, but to health care, to health insurance, to a living wage, to academic opportunities that persist because we live in a capitalistic society that exists because a small number of people have a lot, and the masses of people have little to nothing.
Yes,
now,
the masses.
You're not going to change the economic system of the United States, but the church cannot just become comfortable with the reality that there are masses of people who have little to no access to good, nutritious food at reasonable prices in the areas where they live on a daily basis.
Yes.
And again, that picks up on the whole idea of the term that you use, food theology. There is a theology to food. The argument can be made that there's a theology to everything. But the question becomes, will the church actually speak out on the everything that there is a theology attached to?
Will it speak out, and not just speak out, but move from rhetoric and words to action in order to change the dynamic of what's out there? So we know that we live in a community where food deserts exist, and they're not 20 miles away.
No.
They're
right
a quarter
outside.
of a mile away,
That's correct.
right outside the doors of the church. And so if you have this kind of food inequality, if you have these food deserts where people may not have a grocery store that's near them, and if they don't have transportation, what are they supposed to do? So they have to go to the corner store, where you're not going to get the freshest produce, you're not going to get the best meat or the freshest eggs or whatever it is you need, and it's going to be at a premium price.
Right.
And so the idea of food theology is that we understand that everything, the earth is the Lord's and its fullness thereof, as it says in Psalms. And so that if this is God's, then as caretakers and stewards of God's creation, and that's what we are. Really, that's what that Genesis, that Genesis piece deals with, the fact that we are caretakers. As caretakers or stewards of the creation, how do we ensure that everybody has access to what they need? And what are the things that we have to do in a capitalistic society to kind of upend that? And so for me, it's working in any way we can to make sure that we eradicate food insecurity. Now, because it's good, Shiloh's involved with, we feed the hungry. We do that. But we have to move beyond just feeding. Yes, we have to feed the hungry and clothe the naked, but beyond that, we have to figure out the means to, in some ways, create new systems where then the hungry are able to feed themselves.
Yes.
And we help bring about that. So this is why there's this movement of faith communities saying, we can go back to the earth and we can farm ourselves. We can raise our own produce ourselves and be seasonally based. And it will also help with the idea that we have the rising epidemics of diabetes, of obesity in our community because people don't have access to quality food. And so this is not just about making sure that people have access to food. It's also finding ways to heal our bodies through what we eat and through what we consume.
Sure. Sure. With regard to the academic piece, and I'm going to leave summer camp after this, and you made the point that the certified teachers who work summer camp here at Shiloh are not fatigued to the point that they can't provide quality instruction with energy and enthusiasm in the time that they're here. I'm not an education professional. So for the education professionals who are about to hear what I'm about to say, just take into account that I'm not an education professional. By the same token, if we're 49th in education in this nation as a state, if Louisiana routinely ranks at or near the bottom in education in this state year after year after year, would it not behoove us to think in terms of approaching education in a different manner than this archaic agrarian approach that we have, where we're in school for 9 months and out for 3? That's not based on a desire for people to learn. That's based upon a need for workers to go out into the field and work farms with their parents in order to bring in harvest.
And
well,
a lot of people don't realize
shock of
that's
shocks,
left over. Yeah.
I ain't never worked no farm in the summertime because we didn't have any land to work.
Right.
But we're still operating under an agrarian system that, at least in the state of Louisiana, does not meet the needs of our children. I'm using summer camp as a basis to shift to a different conversation, and that is about education in this state. Shiloh has a summer camp. I venture to say that there are probably 100 churches across this community that will have their own versions of a summer camp, and many of them will have an academic component attached to it. Added to that, many of the public schools this summer will be operating, and school will be in session. In many cases, there will be remedial courses that are going to be offered for children who did not do well over the 9-month period of time that they were in school, and they're going to be expected to make up in 3 months what they did not do in the previous 9 months.
Yes.
Hey, here's an idea. Why don't we go to year-round schooling? And why don't we make it a goal to get children through an academic school year in a 12-month span of time rather than in a 9-month span of time? Year-round schooling works in other areas of the country.
And it works in other places in the world.
Why has Louisiana not embraced that? And I'm not asking you to defend Louisiana. I'm asking you to think in terms of, because you have an academic's heart, and you're deeply invested in scholarship. Why don't we approach education differently than the way that we are, if the goal is to actually educate?
I don't know why that is. And again, I'm not trained in K through 12 education per se. I come from a long line of educators, as you well know, in K through 12 instruction, early education all the way through secondary. But what I would say is that I just think we have to rethink the model of education, period, not just for Louisiana. Because while Louisiana might be 49th, but there's a 48, there's a 47, there's a 40, So, and I say that to say that perhaps we need to look at how we instruct our children, period, in this country, and consider that the model that we have may not be as effective as it is for everybody. I'm not talking for the top 10 or 20% who would do well wherever they were in whatever circumstance. I'm talking about, but looking at, is the model working? And, you have the conversation back and forth, charter schools, no charter schools, magnet programs, no magnet programs. But the point is, all of our kids need to be educated and prepared for life. So if that means maybe we do consider, as other places in the world, year-round education, and you have 4 quarters, and maybe it would be you get 2.5 weeks off or 2 weeks off. I don't think that's out of the realm of possibility if, in fact, that means that we are looking at different ways to make sure that our kids get what they need. However, if all we do is change the timing of the system and don't change any of the other issues that affect the system,
you have to do more than that.
Know.
But picking up on the statistic that you used earlier, that in the time that you are out of school, from the end of one school year to the beginning of another, you lose 2.8 months of education, which means that you spend the first period of the new school year just trying to get children to catch up and remember what they were supposed to have learned the last time around. And since we also know that in many of these situations, not real teaching is going on anyway. Much of what's going on is teaching to the test, the standardized test, where children are being taught how to score well on tests, but they're losing the ability to write. They're losing the ability
think
to
critically.
read. They're losing the ability to think critically.
Write, read, and just have critical thinking skills.
Then perhaps we need to look at how we do this all over again. And if the church is to play a role in that, trying to bring it back to a church setting, then when we're talking about church schools that exist or that want to exist, that want to burst on the horizon, then these church schools have to do more than just be an alternative to a public school. But the church schools have to offer something that is grander in scope than just we're an alternative to a public school, and you can pray here, and because you pray here, that makes our school better.
It has to be.
Truth of the matter is, I went to public school,
different.
and public school never stopped me from praying. All public school said was that you couldn't pray publicly, and the truth is, down here in the South, they did it anyway, and nobody ever said anything about it. But if we're going to be serious about education, and just like there is a food theology, there is an academic theology or an educational theology that is attached to this too, because you can only excel at a rate that is proportionate to your ability to be educated and to pursue the opportunities that education will allow you. Now, I'm the first person to admit educated don't mean smart, and smart doesn't mean educated. But in American society,
prepared.
But in American society today, education opens doors of opportunities to people that you will not ever see opened if you don't have a formal education. But once the door is open, you have to be able to do more than answer A, B, D, E, C as you would do on a standardized test. You have to be able to do more than say true, false, as we do on so many of our tests today. Children today can't write. Don't know what grammar is, don't know how to punctuate a sentence, don't know how to do subject-verb agreement.
Don't know how to diagram a sentence, because if you know how to diagram a sentence, then you fully understand how grammar works, and you're able to use it and know why you're using it the way you're using.
And these things should matter. Especially in terms of developing the ability to, as you say, think critically, and I would probably add think creatively. There is a lack of creativity that exists in so many of our children with regard to the ability to think. Now, they can be creative with a device in their hands, but that's not the same as individual creativity. It is being stunted through the current academic process. And the church needs to first speak out about that, and second, seek to develop ways to respond to that.
Well, I agree with what you're saying. And you said the church needs to speak out and then develop ways to respond or develop new models. It can't be, as you said, that you have churches that do their own schools, and the only difference is, oh, well, you can pray, or this will be a place where you're not allowed to misbehave or fight or cuss or do whatever other things that people do. No, we have to consider, particularly in the African American community, that should there be another model of instruction, so that if you're able to have an independent school at a church, what does that look like? And have you thought through what are the issues that are plaguing our school systems? And have we determined and developed a model that can actually proactively kind of dismantle some of the problems, because we're doing it in a different way? We're thinking about education in a creative way. And I agree that just like with the food theology, or we have to look at education differently and consider, how do we prepare our kids for life? And you're right, a standardized test doesn't do that. And so we have to bring the best minds, those who have been in education, those who study education, those creative people who want to build a brave new world, so to speak, in this arena, and figure out, maybe it's time to, as Jesus, turn over the tables, but completely upend the paradigm and do something different and something fresh. Not that you don't, there are tried and true principles of teaching that never go out of style. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about, how do we fix the model so that then teachers who love to teach, who are excited about teaching, are loose to do that, as opposed to just be disciplinarians, or just be people who have to now teach to a test. Because teachers will tell you, because they say it all the time, as I'm teaching to prepare kids for standardized testing, I'm teaching to the test, and I know that they're not retaining the principles and the information that they're supposed to take. We took standardized tests, but I was taught and I'm a product of public schools. I was taught the important principles and ways to critically think so that regardless of how the test would play out, because I knew the principle, because I knew how to think critically, how to deconstruct a question, then I'd be able to answer the question regardless whether it was essay, multiple choice, true, false, because I understood how to critically think about what is being presented to me. And so I agree. We need to look at and consider if the model's broken, don't just do the same thing in a different spot. How about we need to look at what is the model of education and doing something differently? But again, it's kind of like dealing with the food piece. As churches are taking on ownership of producing their own food and cutting out middle marketers, middle persons between the source of production and the source of consumption, we need to do the same thing with education. Which means the churches who have the resources, whether it be an individual church, a group of churches, perhaps need to say, we want to look at this and bring the best and brightest minds to this educational endeavor, and how can we change the dynamic and come up with a new model and do so collectively?
It's going to take a consensus of progressive thought tempered with traditional teaching methodologies that are heightened to a place of excellence. In too many cases, what I see in church-based schools are churches that are rebelling against the public school system and seeking to say, I can do it better, or I can teach myself. And there's little in the way of progressive thinking that takes place. And there's little in the way of progressive energy in those who are actually asked to do the instruction. The 4th District had a school for a brief period of time, had a secondary school that we operated for about 4 or 5 years, but it was not able to sustain itself because, number one, there was an economics problem.
It was a private school?
It was called Christ's Way Academy. And it operated out of our headquarters, which was located on Prescott Road here in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. It was a well-intended effort, but part of the problem with Christ's Way Academy, and I have seen it in other endeavors, whether it be the charter school or private schools, is that in many cases, because the economics of schools, of education, are so great, you had to ask for teachers to come out of retirement and serve as instructors. And we're talking about people who are in their 60s and their 70s, and they're being asked to go back into the classroom and deal with 8-year-olds and 9-year-olds with incredible amounts of energy. And these instructors, as well-intended as they are and were, they approached education from the training that they received 50 years
ago
earlier.
or 50, right.
And they weren't equipped to deal with the dynamics of 21st century children in a classroom. And the idea that reading, writing, and arithmetic is just reading, writing, and arithmetic simply isn't true. The approach is important. And I don't want this to become a forum on education, but I do think that there's a theological component to what we're talking about as we talk about educating our children and preparing them for the world in the 21st century. After all, the black church is not just the hub of spiritual enlightenment. The black church has a history of being the hub of every kind of enlightenment
right.
that you can think of. It has been the hub of social activity. It has been the hub of community involvement, and it has been the hub of education. Still, in 2018, churches across the length and breadth of this country support public education, either by providing education within their own schools that they have developed, or by supporting education through scholarships and financial stipends to help people to further their education. So education is definitely a part of church life, and I don't think that it is inappropriate for us to say, well, we're doing this anyway. We're playing a role. We ought to at least have a voice in what education looks like as we go further down the road.
Without a question, and really, I guess the nexus or core of that discussion and that voice in education is, how will we partner, or how will we, with an entrepreneurial mindset, do something about the state of education in our community? Because the bottom line, it's our kids that are suffering. So we have a stake naturally. Now the question is, what can we and what will we do about it?
Right. Mm-hmm. Right. Well, I didn't want to spend as much time on that as we did, but I think it's valuable discussion, and we'll probably come back to it again at some point in the future. Beyond summer camp, in your role as Minister of Christian Education here at Shiloh, you have developed a new training program for associate ministers here at the church, and share with us some of that.
Well, our training program, I call it the School for Prophets. It's for associate ministers here at Shiloh, and it recognizes the fact that as ministers and as associates, that we need continuing education, ongoing education, for a number of reasons. One, because you have to stay sharp with your skills with regards to our calling and our vocation. Also, we have to forever, in my opinion, keep ourselves abreast of what are the theological developments that are going on, and how does that impact the church, and then how can we be a part of the discussion of how we better our church, better our community. And so you can't do that from a vacuum. So we gather on a monthly basis, and we do a number of things. One, people know as associates, you may not get the opportunity to preach as much than if you were a senior pastor or a pastor of your own congregation. So we're coming together to work on our homiletical skills, to take a look at scriptural passages, and to not necessarily write sermons, but to discuss collectively, how do you engage a text? What are the steps that you go through to ensure that you are properly exegeting a text? Also, we're reading, my goal is to ensure that we are exposed to the best and the brightest theological minds currently, which means you have to read, you have to know what's out there. Sure. And so we're reading a book now that actually is not a new book, but is very timely, Marvin McMichael's Where Have All the Prophets Gone? And it talks about the fact that as preachers, particularly in the African-American context, we cannot just preach. We also have to stand in the prophetic tradition, the tradition of Amos, of Micah, of Ezekiel, of Isaiah, those who spoke truth to power and who challenged not just their local congregations, but also the wider community, and those who were in power, challenge them to say there is a design that God has for the world and an intention, and are we living up to that? And so that's kind of where the name comes from, the idea of the School for Prophets that you see talked about, particularly in the Book of Kings, but the idea that together we learn. And it gives us an opportunity, as the Bible says, iron sharpens iron, to talk and have a place where we can discuss what's going on with our ministries, as well with theological education. And as you know, I'm I love theological education, the idea of helping ministers to grow and learn and to be shaped so that we become better in our vocation. And that's some of what we're doing, and we're having a wonderful time, and I see it only as growing. Also, it's important because I have a seminary background. You have a seminary background. We both have our Master of Divinity degrees, which is the primary degree for the professional certification for ministers. Not everyone has access to that or has thought through what it would mean to have that seminary education. And so I like to think of this as a way to bring some of that seminary education to us at Shiloh, while always encouraging our associate ministers, you need to be trained.
Right.
And you need to seek out opportunities to be trained. And so I'm encouraging folks, those who want to go to seminary, we figure out how do we do this? What would be the best choice? But bringing the wealth of information and the experience of a seminary context to us here.
For me, it's more than just you need to be exposed to training. I think you need to be exposed to the right training.
Absolutely.
One of the things that I say periodically in Bible study class to my members when they come for Bible study is be careful of where you get your information from. I say this to Sunday school teachers in teachers' meeting. I say it in midweek Bible study because a lot of people diligently go and they try to do their own study. They try to do their own investigation, their own research, because they are genuinely concerned with learning more. And that's a wonderful thing. But my caution is be careful where you get your information from. We're seeing on a national scale today that there's an inherent danger in people who don't read. But there is a worse danger in people who read from the wrong places.
Just as bad, if not worse.
If you're getting your information from the National Enquirer, if you're getting your information from TMZ, if you're getting your information from People and Us, and you're not reading the Washington Post or the New York Times or closer to home, The Advocate, even though I have problems sometimes with The Advocate, but there is a place for light reading, and that's what the Enquirer is. It's light reading. If you want to be entertained about spaceships that landed here into Area 51 and are traveling back and forth to Mars every other day, then read the Enquirer. If you want to learn about what's going on in the nation, then you read something else. You read the Times-Picayune, or you read The Advocate, or you read any one of a number of other substantial newspapers. Transfer that to Bible study, and those who I say gather commentaries, although these days more people opt to get their information off the internet as opposed to the hard books and commentaries. You need to know something about where that information is coming from. You need to know who wrote it. You need to know who edited it. You need to know who prepared it. You need to know something about the background of the group of people who put it together.
The theological perspective of the people that put it together. How do you know that lines up with your personal theology or your denominational theology or the theology of the church where you are a member of a congregation? So you have to know, you're absolutely right, where that comes from. Is it valid? Or is it quack theology?
Right.
And unfortunately, a lot of what's out there on the internet, God forbid, on TV, is quack theology.
Yes.
So how do you discern? Well, there are places to go. First of all, when you deal with seminary programs, we're not even talking about the fact that, there are different levels. You have conservative seminaries and liberal seminaries, if you want to use those kind of terms, which I don't know that they're completely helpful for describing theological education. Different denominational thrust, but you know that if you are affiliated or if you've gone to an ATS accredited seminary, basically if it has been accredited by ATS, that would be the same of going to a school like LSU that is accredited by SACS, or which is a national accrediting agency, a regional accrediting agency. ATS is like that. It's so you know that if you go to an ATS affiliate seminary, then you're able to know that the information that you have received is solid information backed by institutions who have certain standards and who ensure that their instructors have been properly trained in theological education and theological inquiry. And so those kinds of institutions, the people that teach at those institutions, they have the appropriate credentials, and they produce books and articles and commentary series, or they're affiliated with publishing houses that do so, that you know it's going to be quality information.
People should be less concerned with the title of the degree that these schools, some of them, try to draw you in, try to lure you in with, and more concerned with the information itself.
I remember. I looked it up. Association of Theological Schools in the United States and Canada. I don't know. I have almost 50 moment or whatever. Not quite, but almost, toward 50.
My concern is that people get lured into the idea of being able to call themselves doctor this or doctor that because some school that is non-accredited will
Bible college that somebody just
say,
started yesterday.
I don't want to cast aspersions on every Bible college because for some people that's the best that they can do. For economic reasons, for logistical reasons, Bible college is the best that they can do. But I do have a concern with Bible colleges and seminaries, and I'm doing air quotes for those who are listening and not watching. I have a problem with those that will say that you will have a doctorate in theology in 6 months or in a year, and people are lured by the idea of having a doctorate when really the whole idea is to improve your educational knowledge. I find, by and large, that those people who have seminary training from accredited seminaries don't care a whole lot about the degrees. They care more about the information. You don't see them writing with degrees behind their names. You see them interested in learning how to first gather and then employ the information in relevant and practical and reasonable and rational and helpful ways.
Yes.
So I think it's great that Shiloh offers this opportunity internally with our ministers here at the church. I would hope that other churches do some form of the same training. But it is a concern of mine that people recognize the importance of getting good information from good sources and not just grabbing hold of minutia and elevating minutia to a place that it really doesn't belong.
Yes, and along with that, I'm developing for our associate ministers an annotated bibliography on quality resources across the board. So I'm starting with the biblical studies, Hebrew Bible or Old Testament and New Testament, and giving them sources. Also, because we are an African American congregation, I think it's important to highlight the fact that there are African Americans who have done the work. Man, probably took them 6, 7, 8 years to get PhDs in Old Testament or in New Testament, but they write. They've produced commentaries, groups of folks. So I want them to be aware and exposed to that information because they write from a cultural context that is helpful to an African American congregation. And I'm not just using resources from African Americans, got Latino scholars, white sisters and brothers who write from a perspective of liberation, from a perspective.
I was was waiting for that word to come up.
A perspective that meets the social, anthropological, spiritual, practical, theological needs, the holistic needs of African American congregations. And so I'm working on this annotated bibliography that will, I have a little notation. This is an African American New Testament scholar.
Right.
And when I teach and when I preach, and particularly when I prepare to teach our Sunday school teachers, I footnote where something comes from. And I'll say, as this African-American Hebrew Bible scholar says, so that people will know, okay, there's information out there. So the point is, we want you to have good information, right, and know how to discriminate between what makes for good information and what makes for, information that is not as solid, So we want our ministers to be prepared.
In terms of theological perspective, there are various theological disciplines, if I can use that term, that exist, and some schools highlight one over the other. I think that the best schools blend all different facets of theological perspective, but I attended New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary.
An ATS accredited seminary.
A decidedly Southern Baptist school, which had a theological perspective that was more systematic in an approach and more biblical in approach than you might find at some more progressive seminaries. There wasn't a whole lot of positive talk at New Orleans in the time that I was there, 83 to 86, about liberation theology. In fact, we were warned of the inherent dangers of liberation theology. And it was only after my formal training at New Orleans that I ventured to learn more about liberation theology, and eventually came to understand that it is not dangerous, that it is not evil, that it is not heretical, as some professors might have called it, but that it is an approach that I think more closely mirrors or mimics Jesus's approach to the needs of individuals, because it is a holistic approach. The theological training that New Orleans espoused at that time, I don't know what it does today, had to do with language and hermeneutical exegesis of passages, but it was a decidedly European Reformation approach to theological instruction, and not the liberation theology, not the theology that deals with access and opportunity for all.
I was going to say that's likely not that other seminaries wouldn't also have the systematic, the biblical approach, but it's the perspective by which you approach Bible or church history or theology, systematic theology. It's from the perspective, and you said it was decidedly European, and truthfully, many seminary experiences were like that and have been like that. But the idea of liberation or seminaries that are more open to alternative ways of exploring theological inquiry from a liberationist perspective or from a cultural perspective, that has grown. And obviously, in your seminaries that were predominantly African American, that was always going to be a strain of what was discussed. Was how do we approach systematic theology from an African American perspective, or how do we approach biblical studies while reading while Black, or female or black and poor or black. So that's the idea of liberation theology, or now you have post-colonial theology, that where you have scholars from India and other places all around the world who have most recently South Africa in the last 20 or 30 years thrown off the yoke of empire and colonialism. How do you read as someone who has been colonized? So those are different hermeneutical approaches to scripture or to theology, and I think I agree that Jesus was would have been a liberation scholar, because he talked about liberating people. And coming, as it says in Luke 4, he came to preach, sight to the captives, to set at liberty those who were captives, to preach sight to the blind. And so that is a very liberationist mindset. And I'm so grateful and thankful that my seminary experience at Virginia Union School of Theology, the same with Proctor School of Theology, was very much liberationist mindset, because it's predominantly African-American seminary, although it is not completely African-American, people from all races and faith walks, and it's even accredited for United Methodists to go there, so different faith traditions go there. But the point was that making sure that people were prepared to preach and teach and minister from a perspective of liberation. And I'm glad, because that shaped who I am as a preacher, as a minister, as a budding scholar.
At some point, it shapes the perspective of church.
Yes.
Because most of the people who go to seminary don't end up in seminaries as professors and as writers and as historians. They end up as pastors and as members of church staffs in churches across the length and breadth of the nation and around the world. So if your training is not liberation theology, if your training is purely systematic, and I believe in systematic theology. If your training is purely systematic theology, if your training is purely biblical theology, and the biblical perspective is a decidedly European perspective, post 19th or post 15th century perspective at that, with a heavy influence from Bonhoeffer and what took place during World War II. If that's your only frame of reference, then you're missing out on the needs of the masses of people that you are trying to serve, especially if you're African American.
And Bonhoeffer, to name a few, it might be Schleiermacher, it might be others. Of course,
Bonhoeffer is the hero. He's the hero in many of these seminaries. I know we read Bonhoeffer in New Orleans, and Bonhoeffer was the hero because Bonhoeffer bucked against Nazi movements in Germany. Fine. We can see the evil in Nazi Germany. We can see the evil in Hitler. Can we see the evil in 400 years of slavery in this country? Can we see the evil in how we raped and pillaged and took a land that we say we discovered, but there were people here? You can't discover something if folk are already here.
Or can we
acknowledge the fact that Adolf Hitler is not the only evil person ever to exist, but that some of that evil resides within us. We are so quick to want to see the evil in the other that we don't want to acknowledge the evil in ourselves. And yet Jesus says, before you go taking specks out of somebody else's eye, you have to get the 2x4 out of your own eye. And liberation theology challenges us to acknowledge our own sinful past, our own hypocrisy, and to decide that we are going to recreate a framework of theological perspective that highlights the needs of the masses and says that God cares about you because we care about you.
Yes. in that in many ways God is the God of the oppressed. God is on the side of oppressed. And you can't talk about liberation theology without talking about the fact that just this week, James Cone, the father of Black liberation theology, passed, and the impact that he had on not just on Black folks thinking about theology and liberation, but the whole discipline of systematic theology and liberation mindedness, period. And how really his work changed a whole generation of theologians, white and Black, who considered, what does it mean to approach my thought patterns about God from the perspective of being Black, of being Latino, of being Asian, of being poor, of being a underclass, of being someone who is up from slavery, someone who's up from colonialism as your history. And what does that mean? And in many ways, his work shaped my life. It shaped my teacher, my dean former dean at the School of Theology, Dean Kinney, was a student of Cone's, and so that trickled down to me as his student. And we lost a giant, but we will forever have his work, and it is infused in so many of us who have been privy either to him personally or to him through those that he taught. And so he'll be greatly missed.
James Cone was a transformative thinker in the world of Christendom. And much of what he espoused, we saw played out in the work and in the activities of others, not necessarily because one studied the other, but because they shared like-mindedness. The whole civil rights movement was wrapped around the idea of a holistic
Yes.
approach to ministry, and the need to uphold and affirm all lives as being valuable and no life as being superior to another. That's the whole crux of the civil rights movement. We deserve to be treated as human beings just like everybody else does, and not just because we say so, but God says so. Your Bible says so. Even though you don't want to read those parts, even though you don't want to share those parts,
Right.
your Bible says that we deserve to be treated with the same kind of courtesy and respect and humanity and opportunity that others are treated to. And it should not be something that you feel obliged to give to us at your discretion, but it should be something that you recognize and accept as being inherently ours, and respect the fact that it is ours because God says that it is ours. So I too share in the loss of a giant like James Cone. We're almost out of time. We've been doing this for about an hour.
Already.
I wanted to hit one other topic, and then we'll close this out. In addition to losing James Cone, Dr. Samuel B Mckinney
Yes.
died last week, and that's not a name that will be commonplace to many people, but to those who are a part of Black clergy and Black theology, McKinney is probably best known for a book that he wrote on church administration called Church Administration in the Black, or From the Black Perspective. It has served as the benchmark work for many churches over the last 35, 40 years as to how to approach administration of the African American church, and yet develop growing, thriving churches within our own communities. And it's just tragic that we have lost such a giant as Sam McKinney.
Yes, it is. And like you, we studied McKinney's book when I was in seminary. And the thing that I appreciated about it is that his prescription for addressing church administration from the Black perspective in many ways talked about the fact that we're many things, and how do you bring the many together in one, and the idea of the mass class church, or looking at the all the different dynamics of church. I guess church identity is the best way that I can describe it. But particularly that stood out, and I know you've talked to me and you've informed me that it really informed your father, Pastor CT's mindset towards church administration and what it meant to be a mass class church, meaning that we are open and welcoming and comprised of people from all walks of society, and that together we are community, and that we're not segregated to just one social aspect of society and Black folks.
It sought to bring the best of culture and theology together, and to apply it in a way that was relevant and affirming to the life of the church and the community that the church sought to serve. You know, people think of administrative models as being separate and distinct from church vitality and life, but it's not.
And
it's
they
not.
shouldn't be.
Your perspective will shape your vitality.
Yes.
You have to have an idea. I think that far too often we suffer from a shotgun mentality when it comes to church administration, when it comes to church theology. We don't really know what we're trying to hit. So we don't fire a rifle, we fire a buckshot. And the reason why you fire a buckshot is because you're hoping to hit something. And too much of our theology is that way. It's helpful to have an idea of where you're trying to go and who you're trying to serve, and then to develop the model that best suits where you're trying to go and who you're trying to serve. And that's what McKinney provided. Not a specific framework that will work for everybody. Too many books today, writings today, videos today are formulaic. 1, 2, 3, do this, and this, and this will result. Well, just because that worked in your particular setting doesn't mean that it's going to work someplace else. But he did provide a framework that I assume it was his expectation, because this is what happened. He provided the framework, and he expected the pastors and those individual churches to use that framework as the basis to develop their own identity as to the kind of church that they were going to be.
Yes, he did. And his work, like Cone's, it has influenced so many generations of Black preachers and pastors and theologians and church administrators. So he will be missed. But the thing I appreciate about both of their legacies is they taught others, and so their work will continue on. And new generations of theological educators and of seminary professors are growing up on a yearly basis as people want to dedicate their lives also to forming ministers, so that ministers can then go out and form and help reform and transform their church communities where they're served. So it brings it right back to theological education,
right,
and the importance of it, which is where we talked about when we started dealing with the associate ministers, but the idea of the importance of theological education and the seminary bridging the chasm between the seminary and the pew. And McKinney in particularly helped to bridge the chasm from the seminary to the pew,
right,
because his work was so applicable,
right,
to the church context. So
totally agree.
Another giant that we've lost, but their work lives on. So we're grateful to God for that.
Thank you for taking the time to share with us today. Any final thoughts that you want to share?
No, I just want to reiterate again about summer camp that we're starting in less than 30 days, and people still have time to get their kids enrolled, and it's 10 weeks, $80 a week per child. You can't get that anywhere else. The level of instruction and fun that the kids will have, 2 hot meals a day plus a snack in the afternoon, field trips weekly. So consider giving Shiloh a shot.
So if you're in the Baton Rouge area, please give us a call here at Shiloh, 225-343-0640, and ask about summer camp, and we'll be glad to share that information with you. I'm Fred Jeff Smith. I'm glad that you took time to either view or listen to this Thrive podcast. We'll be back next time.